November 12, 1942, Richmond, California. While the German Admiralty still believed it could sink ships faster than the Americans would be able to build them, a newly built shipyard on the west coast of the United States put a 10,000-ton freighter into the water, built in just 4 days. This was a speed that Axis strategists considered unattainable. To them, shipbuilding was a slow, artisanal technical process, a predictable cycle that could never be accelerated without compromising the structural integrity of the ships. But that belief was about to crumble, not by the work of admirals or consecrated naval engineers, but by the hands of a civilian. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship. He did not study naval engineering. His experience was with concrete, dikes, and dams. Still, he was responsible for unleashing the most devastating logistical revolution of World War II. This video reveals how an impossible trick, inspired more by car factories than shipyards, allowed the United States to manufacture ships at an industrial pace, and how this silent break not only thwarted Axis calculations, it sealed the fate of the war at sea, because, in that conflict, winning was not a matter of courage, it was a matter of rhythm. But before we dive behind the scenes of this revolution, there's one statistic that defines everything you're about to discover. In just 4 years, the United States launched 2,110 Liberty ships into the sea, an average of almost 3 per day. Germany, with all its submarines, has never been able to sink at the same rate. What seemed like an underwater war turned into a production race, and what the Germans called unbeatable logic, America responded with serial tonnage. How is this possible? How did a civilian with no naval tradition become the name behind the largest logistical machine in military history? If you value serious research, forgotten facts, and stories that have overturned common sense, leave your like, subscribe, and share this video. This allows us to continue revealing the technical backstage that has often won wars more than the battlefields. Before Henry Kaiser came on the scene, building a ship was an almost ceremonial process. In Kiel, Liverpool, or New York, naval engineering obeyed an unspoken code of tradition. Detailed designs were hand-drawn by respected naval architects, while master builders oversaw teams that had spent a decade or more learning. From the heat of the first rivet to the final fitting of the propeller, welding was taboo. The riveter, an almost sacred profession. Each ship was considered a work of technical art, and it took between 6 and 9 months to be born. The shipyards functioned like guilds with rigid hierarchies, trade secrets, and a pride that disdained any attempt to speed up time. There was glory in that, but also a high cost: slowness. The Germans based their entire naval doctrine on this limitation. The logic was simple. If they could sink 2 Allied freighters a day and the shipyards took 200 days to replace them, the bill would never add up. In 1940, this seemed inevitable. The U-boats prowled the Atlantic like sharks. In June of that year, in just 1 week, 31 merchant ships were sunk. Britain's supply hung by a thread, and the United States, even before it officially entered the war, felt the weight of responsibility. Still, the German admirals had confidence. They did not foresee any rupture. Admiral Karl Donitz, architect of Axis submarine warfare, wrote in his diary, "The advantage is ours. Americans are industrialists, but they are not fast." This phrase would survive as an epitaph of underestimation, because what the Germans didn't know, or refused to accept, was that the concept of shipbuilding was about to cease to be an art and become an assembly line science. In 1940, the average construction time for a 10,000-ton freighter in the U.S. was 230 days. Kaiser would reduce that number to 4. That was not an improvement. It was an epistemological rupture, a collapse of what experts thought was possible. The German Admiralty, still stuck to the doctrines of the previous century, ignored one crucial detail. American industrial capacity was not only large, it was elastic. America didn't need to build any more shipyards to double production. It was enough to reorganize the processes, rewrite the logic. And that's exactly what Kaiser did. By 1941, the U.S. had 14 large civilian shipyards. In 1943, there were 80. But the most shocking number was not in the number of shipyards, but in time. Every 24 hours, 3 new merchant ships were ready. This speed transformed the mathematics of war. I pause here for a fact that the Berlin strategists completely ignored. In 1943, the United States produced more steel per week than Germany produced per month. That's right, per week. If this surprised you, comment below. Shocking data. The concept of naval superiority changed its meaning. It was no longer about keel, hull, and deck. It was about available tonnage, speed of delivery, and industrial pace. While the Axis invested in cutting-edge engineering, silent submarines, acoustic torpedoes, nimble destroyers, the Americans chose raw simplicity. They created an ugly, square, technically obsolete ship, but it could be done in pieces, soldiers in parallel and thrown in days. War at sea ceased to be an art of sailors and became a production race. The Germans did not notice this turn, not out of ignorance, but out of pride. The German Navy believed that efficiency was in the details, not repetition. That strength came from excellence, not scale. It was a logic that made sense in 1916, but in 1942 it proved mortally outdated. In internal meetings, Kriegsmarine officers still spoke of clogging the seas with Allied debris. They did not anticipate that the U.S. would flood them with daily replacements. And not just ships, trucks, tanks, pumps, fuel, wheat, medicine, soldiers. Everything crossed the ocean in the boats that they thought were too slow to keep up with the war. This strategic myopia was not exclusive to Germany. The British Royal Navy itself considered construction by welding too risky. When Kaiser suggested abolishing rivets and adopting electric welding, a common practice in civil works, but unheard of in cargo ships, the reaction was one of technical derision. For the British, this was playing with luck. For Kaiser, it was just industrial logic. The difference was in the focus. While Europeans looked at durability, Americans looked at replacement. For Kaiser, the ideal was not to build indestructible ships. It was to build replaceable ships, quick to assemble, good enough to fulfill their mission and, if they sank, to be replaced in time. This philosophy would change everything. But before she became official policy of the War Department, she had to conquer laughter. Because when Kaiser promised to build 30 ships in less than 2 years, without even having a shipyard, the reaction of veteran shipbuilders was unanimous. He wouldn't last 6 months, but in less than 2 years, he would deliver not 30, but nearly 1,500 ships. And when British Admiral Howard Vickery, one of the fiercest critics of Kaiser's approach, saw with his own eyes a ship being launched after only 4 days of construction, his response was short, but definitive. Perfection is the enemy of enough. In the next chapter, we will follow how this civilian with no naval tradition not only convinced the American government to bet on his madness, but built, from scratch, a shipyard that would overturn centuries of European naval tradition. And he would do this with former secretaries, bricklayers, and housewives. Because war, as he would soon prove, could be won by those who knew how to organize chaos. On December 27, 1940, amid the mounting pressure of German submarine encirclement and the collapse of Atlantic supply routes, the British government signed a contract with a man who, until then, had never built a fishing boat. His name, Henry J. Kaiser, an entrepreneur in the heavy construction sector, responsible for dams and highways. His only link with the sea was the need to cross it to deliver cement. It had no shipyards, no naval engineers, and no maritime tradition. Still, he promised the unthinkable, to deliver 30 cargo ships in record time, and under a methodology that no one in the industry had attempted. Kaiser was seen by many as an opportunist with industrial delusions. The British admirals, desperate for new vessels, accepted the contract not out of conviction, but out of desperation. The Germans were winning. Traditional East Coast shipyards were already operating above capacity, and each new freighter took months to complete. The logistical equation was failing. In London, there were those who said that there were weeks left before the naval blockade starved the United Kingdom into starvation. In the absence of alternatives, the impossible has become a strategy. Kaiser was not known in Washington, but he had already demonstrated something that the military respected: the ability to deliver. His construction of the Hoover Dam and other federal projects had been marked by aggressive deadlines and tangible results. He knew how to coordinate thousands of workers, maintain schedules, and reduce costs without compromising scale. And more than that, he saw the world through the logic of mass production. When the U.S. Department of the Navy and the U.S. Maritime Commission questioned his lack of experience with hulls and propulsion, Kaiser replied coolly, "The problem is not the ship. The problem is the editing." This statement in 1940 was almost a technical heresy. Shipyards operated as sanctuaries of naval craft. Every detail was treated with reverence. Each rivet, supervised. But for Kaiser, the rivet was just a bottleneck. The hull, a module. The ship, a sequence of organizable tasks. Rather than respect the tradition, he proposed to rewrite it. And to do so, he presented a plan that shocked conservatives in the sector: build shipyards from scratch away from traditional naval centers and operate them with trained civilian workers quickly. The proposal was clear and risky. Richmond, California, a mud plain on the edge of San Francisco Bay, would be transformed into an industrial base. There, between rails, cranes, and concrete, the shipyard that would break the rules would be born. Next to Richmond, other hubs were planned: Portland, Vancouver, and Seattle. The plan was to implement a new shipyard concept, no longer based on maritime heritage, but on the logic of automobile factories. In parallel, Kaiser designed a massive recruitment scheme: not just shipbuilders, but farmers, waiters, secretaries, mechanics, construction workers. Anyone with a willingness would be trained. The proposal was revolutionary: standardized tasks, reduce learning time, and repeat processes until functional perfection is achieved. In practice, it meant assembling ships like someone who assembles tractors. This wasn't just innovation, it was an affront. In New York, at the offices of Todd Shipyards, veterans of the First Naval War openly laughed at Kaiser's ideas. The U.S. Navy itself has expressed opposition to simplifying the projects. In internal memos, engineers stated that ships are not automobiles, and that reducing complexity would compromise seaworthiness and safety. But while the experts protested, the Germans kept sinking ships. In 1941, 3.6 million tons of Allied vessels disappeared under the waters. It was the highest loss rate in modern maritime history, and the number only grew. The time for debate was over. All that remained was to act. What few knew, including among his own allies, is that Kaiser not only believed in his plan, but had already begun to build it, even before the formal contract. Using his own resources, contractors he trusted, and a parallel structure, he had already acquired land, started earthworks, and ordered machinery. By the time it received official approval, Richmond's tracks were already being laid. In less than 6 months, what was an empty lot would become one of the largest industrial complexes in the world. Kaiser understood something that most of his critics did not. Modern warfare would not be won with tactics, but with volume. It didn't need technical approval. He needed time, and he bought it quickly. The Navy Department, pressured by mounting losses, decided not to interfere. The contract with Kaiser was seen as a side bet. It would not compete with traditional shipyards. It would be an emergency experiment. But as Vice Admiral Emory Land, chairman of the Maritime Commission, would confess years later, we authorized it thinking it wouldn't work, and then we had to run to keep up with him. Germany never imagined that the United States could respond to submarine warfare with an avalanche of steel. Their mistake was structural. They underestimated the ability of American civilian industry to adapt to war in real time. While Kriegsmarine officers fine-tuned precision torpedoes, Henry Kaiser fine-tuned schedules. While German engineers tried to make their submarines quieter, the Americans made their ships simpler to replicate. The focus was wrong. The enemy was looking at the bottom of the sea. Kaiser was looking at the edge of the factory, and he knew that what would emerge from there was not just a ship. It was a new language of production, one that would reduce the assembly time of a freighter from 230 days to less than a week. And to understand how this logic was applied, one must know the real breaking point, the all-changing visit, where the concept of the naval assembly line was born, not on a dock but in an automobile factory in Detroit. It was in Detroit, on the vibrant, noisy floor of one of Ford Motor Company's plants, that the spark ignited. Clay Bedford, Henry Kaiser's chief engineer, walked between conveyor belts and timed workmen, watching the continuous stream of chassis being assembled with almost choreographed precision. The assembly line, a concept consecrated by Henry Ford decades earlier, was a symphony of productivity. There, each worker did not build an entire car, just a piece, a function, a specific task, repeated to perfection. Bedford returned to the West Coast convinced that he had witnessed something that would change the course of the war. If it was possible to manufacture a car every few minutes, why not adapt the logic for building ships? The idea seemed absurd by naval standards at the time, but for Kaiser there was no absurdity, there was opportunity. The comparison, ridiculed by shipyard veterans, would soon become a method. The plan was simple but subversive: build entire sections of the ship separately in dedicated areas, and then join everything with welding in a final line. It was a complete inversion of the traditional naval model, where the hull was raised in sequence, from keel to deck, in an artisanal, continuous, and linear process. Kaiser would eliminate the sequence. It would introduce parallelism, and with that, he would buy time. The Richmond Shipyard, still under construction, was designed as a manufacturing plant. Prefabrication sectors arranged around 7 main lines. Tracks crisscrossed the complex in all directions. Tower cranes positioned every 30 meters could lift up to 150 tons. The layout was aggressive, redundant, oversized. To the marine engineers of the East Coast, it was a mistake of industrial proportions. For Kaiser, it was the only possible path. The parallel assembly meant that while the bow was welded at one end, the stern took shape at the other. Deck houses were set up in enclosed hangars, protected from rain. The engine rooms, with engines tested on the bench, were only waiting for fitting. The idea was that by the time the keel was laid on the rail, the ship would be almost ready. Like a steel jigsaw puzzle with visual instructions, the ship would not be built. It would be assembled. And more than that, repeated. The Liberty ship, a standardized design based on a British freighter, was designed with a single goal: to be replicable. He was not fast or elegant. It was functional, square, robust, with a capacity for 10,000 tons of cargo. Its engine, a triple expansion steam plant, was already technologically outdated by 1941, but it was simple to manufacture and easy to maintain. The choice of the obsolete was not a mistake. It was strategy. The Liberty was not a ship to win combat. It was a ship to beat statistics. Each Liberty delivered was another link in the chain that fed distant fronts. The emphasis on standardization was absolute. The simplified plans fit into a few drawings. The workers, divided into specific functions, were trained to repeat only 1 or 2 tasks. Instead of training master builders, Kaiser trained specialists in sheet metal sewing, bulkhead installation, vertical joint welding. Each task had a team. Each team had a timed time. Efficiency was born of repetition. The traditional shipyards, upon learning of the plan, reacted with technical disdain. John Riley of Bethlehem Steel visited Richmond in 1941 and wrote in his confidential report, "The prefabrication areas are excessive, the cranes are oversized, the assembly lines are too short, but I must admit that the installation was designed for assembly at a pace never seen before." The recognition came reluctantly, because what Kaiser did was disrespect all the manuals. He did not optimize the past. He invented the future. While the Germans perfected torpedoes with magnetic sensors and operated submarines with millimeter precision, the Americans produced at a relentless pace. In Berlin, no one believed that a civil structure could compete with the technical discipline of German industry. But Richmond was no ordinary factory. In 1942, workers worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The goal was not to build ships. It was to produce rhythm. For Kaiser, the war was not just a military conflict. It was a race against time, and time, in his view, was bought with steel, welding, and simplicity. When the first ships began to roll off the lines, the impact was not just physical, it was psychological. East Coast shipyards, accustomed to dictating industry standards, began to be ordered to adopt Richmond practices. For the first time, the Navy admitted that its doctrine was outdated, not because of inefficiency, but because of speed. In 1943, a report by the Maritime Commission stated that Kaiser shipyards delivered ships 70% faster than traditional ships. If the war dragged on, victory would not come from the admirals. It would come from the schedules. And at the heart of it all, there was a silent break. The decision to abandon rivets and adopt electric welding exclusively, a technology considered unstable, even dangerous, for centuries. But that, in the right hands, would become the new language of the shipbuilding industry. Because Kaiser's next frontier wasn't rhythm, it was steel itself. Since the days of the sailing navy, the rivet was more than a technique. It was a tradition. In British and German shipyards, the metallic sound of hammers on steel marked not only the construction of ships, but the continuity of ancestral knowledge. Riveting was an art. It required precision, synchrony between workers, and a structural strength tested for generations. The naval hull, when held together by thousands of hot-forged rivets, became almost an extension of the human craft. Replace that with electricity. To the old guard, it was heresy. But Henry Kaiser saw no tradition, via delay. His experience in heavy construction, especially in pipelines and high-pressure dams, had shown otherwise. Electric welding, when standardized and applied en masse, was no less safe. It was more efficient. Instead of manually forging each joining point, it was enough to melt the metals with thermal precision. The gain was twofold: less time and less weight. The challenge, however, was cultural. In 1941, the British Navy expressly prohibited welding on war hulls. The risks of fragile fractures in low temperatures, especially in polar seas, fueled institutional fear. The U.S. Navy itself, though more open, required extra reinforcements on the soldier ships, a redundancy that Kaiser considered unnecessary. But he did not ask permission. He asked for results. In Richmond, the assembly lines were adapted from the beginning to receive welded panels. Unlike the rivet, which required double labor, one worker on each side of the sheet, welding could be done by a single professional. The time cut per section reached 30%. What's more, the elimination of thousands of rivets reduced the total weight of the vessel by up to 50 tons, which meant more payload. Kaiser knew this, but his critics saw only risks. At technical meetings, veteran engineers warned that poorly made welds could crack under pressure. Kaiser's response was objective: then let's weld it right. To do this, he set up a lightning training program. Young people, many without any technical training, were trained in weeks to operate MIG welding equipment. Makeshift classrooms spread throughout Richmond and the Oregon shipyards. It was the first time that a welding school had been created on an industrial scale focused exclusively on naval production. The results were immediate. Productivity went up. The number of workers increased. Within a few months, Kaiser was employing 90,000 people, more than 25% of whom were women. In a traditional naval factory, this would be impossible. In Richmond, it was routine. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Welding, already used in civil structures for decades, only seemed radical because the naval tradition insisted on the past. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and finding out how logic won over dogma, like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you more content like this. The clash between rivet and weld was not only technical, it was symbolic. It represented the struggle between the 19th and 20th centuries, between craft and production. While Kaiser's shipyards delivered ships within weeks, others still debated whether the weld would withstand the North Sea. In 1942, an Army commission visited Richmond and witnessed a ship being assembled with 80% welded components. The report was categorical: no sign of fatigue, no structural flaw. The doctrine began to give way. At the same time, the field tests gave reason to the boldness. In March 1943, the SS Joseph N. Teal, fully soldier, weathered a storm in the Pacific with 12-meter waves. No cracks were found after inspection. Critics were silent, and the war was grateful. The time that was gained with welding was time that translated into lives saved, food delivered, ammunition landed. The Germans, however, still based their calculations of destruction on ancient rhythms. They did not understand that the structure of the ships had changed, that the frail American soldier could be replaced faster than a reloaded torpedo, and more, that production, previously centralized in historic shipyards, was now distributed, accelerated, and replicable. The decision to weld instead of rivet was not just a technical choice, it was an act of war, because steel held together by electricity marked the beginning of a new era, the era of war production as a moral force. And if the ships were changing, so were the workers who built them. In the next chapter, we will see who really built the American victory, not in the offices, not in the barracks, but on the rails, the cranes, and the welding masks. The largest civilian labor force ever mobilized on the territory of the United States. They did not wear uniforms. They did not carry weapons. They did not receive medals. But quietly and under pressure, they shaped the backbone of the Allied victory. When Henry Kaiser decided to build ships as if they were automobiles, he knew that the working model would also have to change. The naval tradition required decades of training. Kaiser had weeks. Time was the scarcest resource of the war, and the most valuable. The answer would not come from the shipyards, but from the cities and farms. The draft began without fanfare, but soon turned into a mass movement. Men who had never seen the sea were hired to set up decks. Housewives learned to operate blowtorches. Former truck drivers, clerks, secretaries, and students abandoned their civilian routines to transform steel into ships. The profile of the worker has changed. In Richmond, More than 40% of the workers came from outside California. They were migrants, Southerners, African Americans in search of work and dignity. Kaiser didn't just accept them, he promoted them. When asked about the risk of hiring women for a heavy industry, his answer was pragmatic. They have firmer hands to weld. Within months, thousands were on shifts, masked, silent, operating machines with the precision that war demanded. The shipyard has become a laboratory of forced inclusion. Time did not allow prejudice. There was no room for technical elitism. What mattered was to repeat accurately. Each worker was given a clear task: cutting, molding, welding, inspecting. Intensive training, 2 to 5 days, was sufficient for specific functions. The logic was brutally effective. Fragment the complexity, standardize the gesture, multiply the force. The Liberty ship didn't need artists. It needed perfect repeaters. That was what the workers became, specialists in industrial microtasks. If assembling a ship involved thousands of decisions, Kaiser eliminated most. Each section was made in parts, and each part had an owner. A 52-year-old lady was welding the curve of the side. A 17-year-old, dismissed from the war by short-sightedness, adjusted the supports of the engine room. Nobody knew how to build an entire ship, but everyone knew how to do their part. Efficiency was born from some. In 1943, the Richmond shipyards employed 90,000 people simultaneously. It was the largest civilian workforce mobilized on American soil, and it operated like an army. 8-hour shifts, 3 times a day, every day of the week. There was no Sunday. There was no holiday. The war required pace. Productivity was audited. Boards with daily numbers were posted in the cafeterias. Each day, they knew how many tons had been welded, how many sections assembled, how many ships completed. Morale came from numbers, not emotion. Even so, there was pride, because with each launch, a siren was triggered, and everyone stopped to watch the hull slide into the water. It was an industrial ritual. No glory, no speeches, just the sound of steel fulfilling its function. And, paradoxically, this civilian army surpassed the military in effectiveness. By 1942, U-boats were sinking an average of 60 ships per month. In the same period, American shipyards launched 100. It was an inverted equation. The mathematics of destruction no longer kept pace with that of production. The Germans did not know this. They still trusted in the enemy's slowness. Dönitz kept asking for more submarines. But what no Abwehr report predicted was that a force of housewives, farmers, and inexperienced laborers had become the most efficient delivery machine of the war. The logic of war had shifted from the sea to the dock, and at the heart of this transformation was the ultimate symbol of speed, a ship that took no 230 days to be born, nor 30, nor 10. It took only 4, a feat that the naval world considered impossible, and that, in the next chapter, would leave Germany without an answer. SS Patrick Henry was the first. Launched on September 27, 1941, she was completed in 197 days, a time considerably faster than traditional shipyards, but still far from what Kaiser had promised. Many saw this as a confirmation of initial skepticism. For critics, it was just further proof that the industrial rhythm could not be imposed on the sea. But something began to change. The second ship left in 169 days. The third, in 143. The fourth, 135. The fifth, 128. The numbers, almost without fanfare, began to plummet. No ads, no celebrations, just steel being assembled more accurately, faster, more predictably. The machine was working. It was as if the shipyard had learned to breathe. Each sector found its rhythm. Each welder found his curve. Each crane, its ideal rotation. Errors were reduced. Repetitions generated efficiency, and what once seemed like chaos has become a metric. It was not a miracle. It was applied statistics. Parallel production, until then considered risky, proved its strength. Sections that had previously required manual adjustments now fit together perfectly. The measurements matched. The deadlines were closing. The ship was no longer a project. It became a product. In Richmond, this transformation was felt in the details. The assembly time of the engine room has dropped from 12 to 4 days. The hull, previously erected in 40 sections, was now divided into 250 smaller, lighter, easier to manipulate modules. Electrical installation, which previously required specialized teams, has been simplified with plug-in systems. Everything was designed to accelerate. The effect was cumulative. With each ship delivered, the next one was faster. The production chain learned from its own movement. It was a collective intelligence, but without a computer, a human algorithm of repeat, adjust, and execute. Meanwhile, in traditional naval engineering circles, uneasiness was beginning. In 1942, U.S. Navy engineers were sent to Richmond with a quiet mission to understand what Kaiser was doing. Internal reports began to circulate. One of them, confidential, stated, "The production is chaotic at first glance, but functional in its internal logic. It doesn't follow conventional standards, but it delivers accurately." It was the first time the system had admitted something new had been created, and it could no longer be ignored. East Coast shipyards began copying the methods. Prefabrication lines were hastily installed. Additional cranes were ordered. Even the shift structure was adapted. Kaiser was no longer a joke. He was a model. While the admirals discussed strategies in the Atlantic, the numbers spoke in Richmond. In September 1942, a Liberty was launched in 29 days. In December, another in 10. In March 1943, the SS Robert E. Peary broke all records. 4 days and 15 hours between the keel's laying and its entry into the water. The feat was not only technical, it was symbolic. A civilian shipyard, set up by a man with no naval experience, with common workmen and heretical methods, had overcome doctrine. American newspapers called the Peary a ship that fell from the sky. But what really fell was the illusion that tradition was enough. And on the other side of the Atlantic, in Berlin, a report from the Kriegsmarine arrived on Admiral Donitz's desk. In it, a sentence summed up the new German dilemma. If they continue at this pace, we can no longer win by drowning. The German nightmare would not come from the cannon, it would come from repetition. And that repetition was about to become an avalanche. While Germany sank freighters in the Atlantic, believing it was suffocating the logistical lungs of the Allies, a parallel war was taking place on the other side of the world, not at sea, but within the United States itself. It was the war of the shipyards, and Henry Kaiser, who had already broken with the naval tradition, decided to break with the internal logic of production. Instead of centralizing and coordinating from top to bottom, he floated a bold idea: turn each of his shipyards into rivals. Richmond, California against Portland, Oregon. Assembly lines versus assembly lines. Workers against workers. The logic was simple. Where there is competition, there is overcoming. With each ship launched, a panel was updated. The name of the shipyard, the construction time, the number of man-hours employed. Headlines in local newspapers celebrated each record-breaking as a championship victory. The workers' culture, previously based on routine, began to breathe dispute. The cranes were given nicknames. The welding groups got mascots. Pride is no longer just in the total number. It is now in the rhythm. In Portland, the Swan Island shipyard was producing ships in 12 days and publicly challenged Richmond to see if it could do better. Richmond responded with hand-painted signs. Here steel flies. Kaiser's industrial empire was no longer just technical. It became psychological. The workers did not compete for bonuses. They competed for honor, and the honor was measured in steel launched, in a beaten time, in the number of ships delivered per month. It was the Detroit spirit applied to naval warfare. The effect of this internal rivalry was brutal. In 1943, Richmond launched 204 ships, Portland 182, but construction times kept falling. The average production of a Liberty ship had been reduced to 23 days, and it kept falling. The shift structure has been reworked. Workers began to work under visible goals. Productivity groups received commemorative flags. The anniversaries of each ship launched were celebrated with sirens. The symbol of war was no longer the rifle. It was the stopwatch. The Germans, trapped in the logic of scarcity, did not understand what they were facing. The Kriegsmarine believed that by sinking 2 ships a day, it would suffocate the Allies. But he ignored that. In that same period, the U.S. was launching 3. In absolute terms, American naval production was 15 times higher than German in 1943. Yes, 15 times more ships delivered than Germany could build. If you were surprised by this disparity, write in the comments a phrase that defines this turnaround: absolute power, unbelievable, or logistics wins. This shows us that these forgotten truths are worth revealing. In absolute numbers, Kaiser's shipyards delivered 1,490 Liberty ships. He single-handedly built more than 55% of the entire American logistics fleet of World War II. No admiral in history had commanded so much steel, and no general has ever relied so heavily on invisible civilians. But the most impressive thing was not the quantity, it was the culture. Because by turning production into competition, Kaiser created something bigger than a shipyard. He created an idea, and this idea would soon be applied not only to the construction of freighters, but also to another challenge: creating a fleet capable of feeding troops, tanks, ammunition, and fuel, and still being disposable. A brutal logic that would require a new type of engineering, one that the Germans did not know how to fight. In November 1942, something unprecedented happened at the Richmond shipyards. It was not a new ship. It was not a secret weapon. It was time. More precisely, the brutal compression of it. SS Robert E. Peary was started at 12:01 p.m. on the 8th. At 3:27 p.m. on the 12th, the hull was in the water. 4 days and 15 hours. The feat was so extraordinary that the Navy ordered the presence of cameras. Admirals, engineers, and skeptics were invited to testify. And as the 135-meter hull glided down the tracks towards the bay, there was no applause. There was silence, the kind of silence that succeeds the impossible. The Robert E. Peary wasn't just a ship launched. It was a statement, a definitive break with everything that was believed about naval engineering. The operation had been millimetrically timed. All 250 modules had been prefabricated in advance. Each section was moved by giant cranes, fitted by electric soldiers, inspected by dedicated crews. The shipyard became a stage. Steel, the protagonist. Time, enemy vanquished. And tradition, a defeated spectator. For the engineers present, the doubt was no longer whether it was possible. It was how it had taken them so long to understand. Peary was not the beginning of a new era. It was confirmation that she had already begun, and was advancing at an uncontrollable pace. The impact was immediate. The Secretary of the Navy sent an internal note. Doctrine must adapt to the pace, not the other way around. In Washington, planners began to recalculate all Pacific logistics based on the new delivery speed. It was no longer necessary to protect each ship as irreplaceable. Now there was a surplus. There was a reservation. There was repetition. On the German side, the news came with disbelief. Naval intelligence initially classified the launch as propaganda, but the numbers didn't lie. In less than 5 days, a functional ship, ready for cargo, had been launched. The American rhythm had overcome the logic of destruction. The Axis could sink whatever it wanted. Production would come first. British newspapers called the Peary the freighter that beat time. But the real winner was Kaiser, because at that moment, the unthinkable was recorded, and it was never possible to go back. The Atlantic War, which the Germans believed they could win with steel and torpedoes, had been won with welding and method. And if a Liberty could be built in 4 days, what else could Americans manufacture at war pace? The answer lay in the tracks, the depots, and the convoys, where America's real weapon hadn't yet been revealed. The invisible logistics chain that would turn every Liberty ship into an extension of the battlefield. For Nazi Germany, naval warfare was mathematical. The plan was old, rehearsed since the First World War: isolate Great Britain, blockade its ports, sink its convoys. Without food, without fuel, without weapons, the island would fall. The Type 7 submarines, fast and lethal, were designed for this siege. By 1941, they were winning. The U-boats operated in packs, hunting in groups, synchronized by radio. The North Atlantic has become a graveyard for ships. In some months, the average was 2 Allied freighters sunk per day. Donitz's doctrine was clear. Production could not keep up with the loss. And for a while, that was true. England, dependent on the Empire, saw its stocks dwindle. Rationing tightened. The USSR, pressed on the Eastern Front, desperately needed the convoys from Murmansk. The Germans knew this. They bet everything on maintaining the sinking rate. But the calculations had a flaw. They came from the world of before. Before Kaiser. Before assembly lines. Before ships in 4 days. German logic assumed that each sunken freighter took 230 days to replace. It was a reasonable time, based on decades of traditional naval production. But in 1943, the equation that underpinned the entire blockade strategy imploded. Instead of losing 1 ship and taking 8 months to replace, the Allies were delivering 3 a week. Richmond, Portland, South Portland, Baltimore, New Orleans, Mobile. Every city has become an artery. The production did not compensate for the loss. He surpassed it. In April of that year, U-boats sank 48 ships. In the same month, the Americans released 117. The logistical collapse was not on the Allied side. It was on the German side. Because the strategy, which was so precise before, did not provide for an industry that would function as an organism. The mistake was one of perception. In 1942, the Germans produced 238 submarines. In the same year, the U.S. produced 1,185 merchant ships, a difference of almost 5 times. And the most ironic, submarines were increasingly expensive, freighters increasingly cheaper. Germany invested in complexity, the USA in repetition. In the corridors of the Kriegsmarine, tension grew. Dönitz himself, upon receiving the Allied spare numbers, wrote in his diary, "We no longer have an advantage at sea." It was the first time the U-boat commander admitted that the tide had turned, because industrial logic could no longer be defeated with tactics. The Liberty ship was slow, visible, unprotected, but it was replaceable, and its price was German defeat. Every Liberty that came along was a disproved calculation, a turnaround statistic, a prediction that was not fulfilled. The strategy of attrition required industrial superiority, and that had changed hands. The Third Reich, which saw itself as the heir to Prussian engineering, was now run over by civilian workers in welding masks. The irony was bitter, and the most devastating thing was yet to come. The convoys that once carried weapons now carried something more precious. The shipyards themselves, disassembled into pieces, ready to rebuild ports, roads, and bases anywhere on the planet. A logistical mobility that would transform the war into a planetary operation. They weren't in the history books. They did not sign treaties. They did not command divisions. But they built, with anonymous hands, the largest supply line ever conceived in a war. The American logistical victory was not just the product of machines, it was the work of people. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 190,000 civilian workers passed through Henry Kaiser's shipyards. Of these, more than 40,000 were women, more than 30,000 were African Americans. Many others came from the rural South, from indigenous reserves, from immigrant neighborhoods. What united them was not origin, but function, and function was everything. In the Richmond shipyards, the traditional hierarchy lost strength. The color of the skin didn't matter when the weld needed to be completed in minutes. The surname carried no weight when the crane needed to operate accurately. War required productivity, not pedigree. For the first time, the American war effort was marked by a kind of industrial meritocracy. He who delivered, advanced. The night shift, once considered a punishment, has become a symbol of resilience. Women welders like Rosie the Riveter are no longer an exception. They became a base. They occupied the most dangerous platforms, the narrowest spaces, the highest scaffolding. Most of them came without any experience. They learned in 2 weeks what used to take years, and they delivered. African Americans barred from various industries found in the shipyards a mobility gap. Kaiser broke with the tradition of exclusion by appointing black supervisors, something unthinkable in military factories at the time. The integration was partial, but real, and the production reflected that. Efficiency rose with diversity. The statistics proved it. The shipyards with greater inclusion had higher yields. American industrial production became not only a symbol of strength, but of social reorganization. And the Liberty ship, with its functional simplicity, began to carry more than weapons and food. He carried an idea. It carried a symbol. It represented the concept that anyone, trained, aligned, and integrated into an efficient system, could deliver results on a global scale. The ship, rough-looking, was the negation of elitism. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. It wasn't fast, but it arrived. It was not invincible, but it was replicable. And this replication was only possible because ordinary men and women had been incorporated as parts of a moral machine. Industry was no longer a cold structure. It was a collective organism. The Liberties, launched with sirens and applause, represented human effort materialized. Each rivet welded by a 20-year-old girl was a small defeat imposed on the logic of destruction. Each slate assembled by a man who had never entered a technical school was a hit against the arrogance of the German command, and the workers knew it. Many pinned pictures of their children on the panels. Others engraved initials on the internal structures. They would not see the battlefield, but they knew that their gestures shaped the fate of those who would cross it. At the end of 1944, an intercepted letter from the German side revealed the desperation of the calculations. Even if all our torpedoes hit, they keep coming. The author was a naval intelligence officer. He did not mention warships. It mentioned freighters. Because now even the enemy knew the Liberty was no longer just steel. It was a crowd. And this crowd was about to cross the ocean in two directions, carrying not only supplies but also roads, bridges, ports, and fuel for a new phase of the war. In less than 2 years, what began as an isolated experiment in Richmond Bay has become national doctrine. Henry Kaiser's success did not remain restricted to California. It was copied, adapted, and, most importantly, institutionalized. By the end of 1943, 18 U.S. shipyards were operating with variations of the same model: parallel production, prefabricated sections, electric welding, continuous shifts, and integration of unskilled civilians. It was more than a method. It was a new industrial idiom. The old shipyards in the East resisted at first, but soon realized either they followed Kaiser or they would be left behind. In Mobile, Alabama, in Wilmington, North Carolina, in South Portland, Maine, the cranes were turning at the same rate. The steel tracks moved to the sound of the same sirens. The Liberty is no longer just a ship. It has become a replicable model. The expression Kaiserization began to circulate in military memoranda. The Navy manuals were rewritten. The training of engineers was reformulated. The U.S. War Department officially acknowledged that shipbuilding was now an assembly operation, not a design operation, a conceptual leap with global impact. And the world watched. British, Soviet, and Canadian technical missions visited Richmond in 1944. They studied each step, each plant, each inventory control system. Japan, which until then had maintained a naval industry based on artisanal excellence, saw its doctrine collapse in the face of the enemy scale. Even building fearsome battleships, such as the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the Japanese were unable to supply their merchant marine, which was shrinking under American air and naval attacks. The reason? Lack of replacement. The Allies, on the other hand, dropped freighters almost as often as they dropped tanks. In 1944, while Germany produced 19 submarines per month, the U.S. launched 50 freighters per week, an absolutely overwhelming pace. If this data impressed you, comment below with the phrase "logistics wins." This helps us understand if we are revealing the right data, the data that explains the victory. The impact went beyond the war. In 1945, with the end of the conflict approaching, engineers from South Korea, Japan, and Western Europe were sent to the United States to study Kaiser's shipyards. They weren't just looking for technology, they were looking for organization. The post-war period would be a world to be rebuilt. Ports, railways, civilian and military fleets, everything would need to be rebuilt. And no one had demonstrated as much ability to do this at scale as the Americans. The Kaiser model would be absorbed by an entire generation of industrialists of the 20th century. Hyundai, which would become a South Korean naval power, would base its assembly logic on the pattern established in Richmond. The Japanese shipyards of Mitsubishi and Kawasaki would reorganize their supply chains following North American logistics principles. In Europe, the Marshall Plan would finance reconstructions based on production models derived from Kaiser's doctrine of war. The war had turned a civilian into a global technical reference. What's more, it had revealed that true industrial power lay not in isolated genius, but in the ability to organize thousands of ordinary people around a common goal. And while the world was still learning this lesson, something even more ambitious was beginning to take shape. Ships wouldn't just be made to transport supplies, they would be shaped to carry invasions. Because in the next phase of the war, it would not be enough to build fast. It would be necessary to land heavily, and the Liberty, until then king of logistics, was about to get a more aggressive brother, the LST, tank landing ship. World War II was won with gunfire but decided with boxes. While the eyes of the world were on tanks advancing in Normandy or bombers flying over Berlin, the real force that fueled this movement came from the sea. Silent, constant, invisible. It was made of tons of canned food, fuel drums, tires, radios, boots, engine parts, railroad tracks, packaged blood, generators, ammunition, and technical manuals. All this, day after day, crossed oceans in the same type of vessel, the Liberty ship. Each of these ships carried about 10,000 tons of payload, enough to supply a room for weeks. When the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942, it was the Liberties that took the jeeps. When the tanks crossed France, they were the ones who brought the diesel. When winter closed the skies on the Eastern Front, it was these freighters who delivered the bales of butter and the locomotive rails to the Soviet coast. Logistics wasn't just a prop. It was the offensive itself, because what the Red Army needed to keep the armor moving, the U.S. Navy was already sending through huge logistical agreements. The Liberty became the symbol of a new war, a war of supply, and this supply was uninterrupted. Operation Overlord, the largest landing in history, would not have lasted 2 days if behind the troops had not come an invisible fleet of supplies. With each tank that advanced, 4 ships delivered fuel. With each grenade thrown, 100 new boxes arrived by sea. It was a cruel equation for the enemy. Even if they caused severe casualties, even if they destroyed convoys, the pieces arrived. New troops, new tires, new rifles. There was no exhaustion. The Germans, who invested in heavy tanks and V-guns, were unable to replicate the essential, the aftermarket chain. The Tiger was deadly, but it required 100 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers, and when the fuel ran out, it became a static monument. The Sherman, on the other hand, although technically inferior, received fuel and parts with mathematical regularity. It was easy to repair, easy to produce, easy to replace, as well as the ships that transported it. In the Pacific, the pattern was repeated. Each island taken was immediately supplied by Liberty ships. Within days, there were warehouses, field hospitals, construction machinery, mobile bakeries, and radio stations. Japan could not keep up. Its freighters, few and poorly defended, were destroyed within months. The empire became a starving archipelago, unable to replenish its own forces, because, in the end, winning was not about controlling territory. It was to control refueling. And America, with its shipyards functioning as arteries, has made the ocean a living production line. By 1944, every hour, 2 Liberty ships were crossing the Atlantic. Every minute, dozens of tons landed at some port. This constant stream strangled the enemies without fanfare. No parade, no glory. If this surprises you, remember that a single Liberty ship carried, on average, 230,000 supply boxes. Multiply that by 2,710. This is how you win a war, not with slogans, with volumes. And the Germans knew. In an Abwehr report, Reich intelligence admitted, "We cannot intercept everything, and what we don't intercept defeats us." It was the indirect surrender of military logic. But the greatest irony was yet to come, because the Liberty ships themselves, fragile, ugly, disposable, would be responsible for one last maneuver, transporting what no weapon could produce, an entire army ready to rebuild the world. When victory was declared, the sound that dominated Richmond was not that of celebrations. It was silence. The sirens of the shipyards, which for 4 years marked the rhythm of the industrial tides, suddenly fell silent. Assembly lines were interrupted, the cranes immobile, the warehouses emptied, and the workers who had produced the impossible day after day disappeared as if they had never existed. Richmond, which housed more than 100,000 workers in its heyday, became a suspended city, living in the shadow of a glory it did not claim. The same thing happened in Portland, in South Portland, in Mobile. The war effort, which had been so celebrated, was quickly shelved. The Liberty ships, now in excess, were pulled over, sold, converted, forgotten. Many sank by accident. Others were used as floating deposits. Few survived. And with them, the memory of those who built them also sunk. There were no parades for the workers. There were no medals for the welders. There were no films about the 18-hour days, nor about the burned fingers, nor about the children raised in the improvised accommodations next to the shipyards. Industrial effort was treated as a statistic, not as heroism, and perhaps this was the greatest mistake in the historiography of war, forgetting that, without these anonymous civilians, the heroes in uniform would have marched in vain. Kaiser, who during the conflict had been viewed with suspicion, did not seek fame after peace. He continued to work on civilian projects, such as hospitals and infrastructure, but the world that once scoffed at his ideas now treated them as evidence. What was innovation has become a standard. What was a bet has become doctrine. Still, its shipyards were closed, the structures rusted. Women who had assumed male roles returned to their old social roles, often without recognition, without option. African Americans who had found a mobility gap lost ground to veterans returning to the workforce. The Liberty ship won the war, but it didn't win the memory. His name does not figure among the great deeds of humanity. Its builders have no place among the martyrs. And yet they were the ones who beat Hitler without pointing a rifle. In 1947, a British naval historian wrote, "The Atlantic War was decided not by the warships, but by the cargo ships, and the Americans produced them as if they were producing bread. But industrial bread, as essential as it is, never appears in the banquet photo. There still remained an unanswered question, one that few dared to ask, whether the Liberty ships saved the war, who would save his memory? Among the thousands of hulls launched in record time, only 2 have survived time with the dignity of memory intact. The SS John W. Brown, anchored in Baltimore, and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, silent guardian of history in San Francisco. They were not chosen for their glory in combat, nor for exceptional feats at sea. They were preserved for another reason, because they represented everyone else. Each of them carries on their decks the memory of a system that turned civilians into victory operators. Both still float, still sail. They still emit the deep sound of the sirens that once moved entire nations. The O'Brien even crossed the Atlantic again in 1994 for the ceremonies of the 50th anniversary of D-Day, and not just as a museum piece, but under its own engine, navigating with the engineering precision that had once been called impromptu. The John W. Brown, in turn, now hosts exhibitions, educational events, and memorial ceremonies. Its corridors are crossed by students who may never have heard of Henry Kaiser, but who are amazed at the idea of a freighter being built in 4 days. There, between riveted steel plates and cramped cabins, lives the concrete testimony of a generation that did not wait, that he did not ask for the spotlight, that he just delivered. The irony of this story is that the Liberty was created to be short-lived. His design was disposable, its welds efficient but cheap, their comfort non-existent. It was made to endure until its final destination, and then to be replaced. But what was born for discard survived as a symbol. Haste, when accompanied by method, can generate a legacy. These 2 ships are today the floating reminder that logistics also has a soul, that strategy can also be measured on cranes and not just on maps, that there is honor, yes, in assembling, organizing, and repeating. If you've made it this far and are enjoying discovering these hidden gears of victory, show your support. Like and subscribe. This allows us to continue bringing to light the stories that the post-war rush has all but erased. But one last number is still missing, one that no manual predicted, because behind the decks, there were faces, and many of them left diaries, letters, notes, and testimonies. The voice of those who built it, not the war, but the path to it. And it is this voice that will echo in the next part. Henry J. Kaiser did not wear a uniform, he did not command troops, he did not design invasion strategies. And yet he was one of the men who most influenced the outcome of World War II. Their power did not come from the military hierarchy. It came from the industrial mentality. Kaiser did not see the impossible as a technical obstacle, but as a symptom of disorganization. When they said that a ship needed 230 days to build, he asked how many of those days were in fact used in active production. When they said that welding was unstable, he analyzed the real rate of failures. When asked if it was safe to let women operate cranes, he responded with training. That's how I thought. Numbers, efficiency, cold analysis, practical confidence, and above all, faith in the organization as a transforming force. Behind the scenes at his shipyards, Kaiser created more than ships. He created an ecosystem, organized routines, assembly standards, parallel inspection systems, internal supply lines, shift management models, and even health programs for workers. Together with Dr. Sidney Garfield, he implemented an experimental medical plan for the workers and their families. What began as an emergency solution to deal with dock injuries became the embryo of a system that would later be called Kaiser Permanente, a cooperative, preventive, and integrated health model, a silent revolution in the bowels of war. Kaiser did not separate production from people. He knew that exhausted workers produced less, that queues at the outpatient clinics generated delays, that poorly organized cafeterias discouraged shifts. He studied each phase as if it were a steel cog, and treated humans as an essential part of the machine, but never as disposable parts. Their internal memos reveal this. In one, when discussing the drop in night shift productivity, Kaiser didn't ask for cuts. He asked for background music, improved lighting, and a new kind of energy snack. For him, workers' morale was logistical fuel. Contrary to the industrial tradition of the time, it did not see workers as a raw mass. I saw them as operators of a mission, and so he communicated clearly. He wrote bulletins explaining why each ship was important. It displayed productivity graphs in the corridors. He shared victories with the team. It stimulated healthy competition between shipyards. It created meaning, and meaning generates rhythm. Kaiser was also pragmatic. When demand for steel threatened to halt production, it didn't wait for government help. It created its own internal rail transport system. He organized floating deposits. It hired specialists outside the naval industry, and he absorbed criticism as inputs. When engineers called him an amateur, he invited those same engineers to optimize the processes. When the Navy complained about the aesthetics of the ships, it presented efficiency charts. His leadership was not charismatic. It was functional, and because of this it was often ignored by the spotlight. But without it, none of the other chapters would have happened. Kaiser was the gear that turned silently, but supported the entire structure. At the end of the war, he rejected political offers. He continued creating. He built hospitals, dams, aluminum factories, founded universities, and expanded the health system that had been born in the shipyards. He was called the people's businessman, but he did not seek labels. He sought efficiency with purpose. To understand Henry Kaiser is to understand that modern warfare is not won with courage alone, but with intelligent organization. It is not won only with soldiers, but with systems. And maybe that's why the enemy never saw him coming, because he expected generals, and he found logistics. But one last acknowledgement was yet to come, one that did not come from Congress, nor from the newspapers. It came from where it was least expected, on the other side of the Atlantic. A confidential report, written by a German officer containing a single sentence. We underestimated American production, and we did not consider that a civilian without a uniform could be the architect of our defeat. For centuries, knowledge was passed down as a relic, from engineer to engineer, from shipyard to shipyard, from tradition to tradition, and with it came dogmas, beliefs so ingrained that it was no longer possible to distinguish between what was science and what was ritual. Among them, one remained unquestionable. Large ships require great time. You don't mount a freighter like you mount a car. This phrase has been repeated to exhaustion by specialists, technical councils, admirals, and academics. Everyone was right, until Henry Kaiser proved everyone wrong. He was not a naval engineer. He had not studied at Harvard. He had not attended Annapolis. It had no shipyards, no tradition, no political godfathers. I had a simple question. Why not? That question, asked by someone outside the system, was more dangerous than any German submarine, because it did not respect the established limits. When told that welding was unstable, Kaiser asked for tests, not opinions. When they said there wasn't enough manpower, he opened daycare centers in the shipyards so that mothers could work. When they said that parallel assembly would generate chaos, he responded with schedules. Kaiser did not seek to reinvent the wheel, only to organize it. The irony is brutal. While renowned engineers refined centuries-old methods with millimeter obsession, a factory-minded civilian surpassed them with basic flow discipline. Because the problem was not technical, it was cultural. Naval tradition did not accept being questioned. Kaiser, out of ignorance or daring, questioned everything. And he won. There's a name for it in science: wisdom inversion, when accumulated knowledge out of excessive respect blocks the possibility of revolution, when experience, instead of illuminating, blinds. And that's exactly what happened. The Axis bet on logic, but the logic was old. He bet on Allied predictability, but the unpredictable came from the one place where no one expected it: American civil engineering. In the end, the biggest miscalculations weren't logistical, they were mental. It was the certainties of the experts that sank. It was the diplomas that did not see the obvious. A war freighter didn't have to be a masterpiece. It needed to be fast, precise. It is replaceable. Kaiser's shipyards were living proof that industrial revolutions don't have to come with fanfare, but with spreadsheets. And perhaps for this reason, to this day, the industry still hesitates to study his trajectory in depth. because it deconstructs the hierarchy of expertise, because it shows that renewal sometimes comes from those who have never been invited to the meeting. But the story does not end at the shipyards. There was still one chapter to go, one that would link the Liberty's steel to the doctrine of victory, because contrary to what many think, the secret was not in the ship. It was in what he was carrying, and in what made his mission possible, the invisible artillery of war. In a world where containers pile up in ports, supply chains stall for weeks, and semiconductors become as rare as oil, the story of the Liberty ships resurfaces as an uncomfortable whisper of the past and a direct provocation to the present. Because in 1942, the world was experiencing a much greater logistical collapse. The Atlantic was infested with submarines, England on the verge of shortages, the Soviet front begging for ammunition and food. And yet in just 36 months, the United States managed to organize the largest production, transportation, and delivery operation in human history. And they did it to civilians, with unskilled workers, with shipyards created from scratch, with health systems, strict schedules, and assembly lines that had never been tested on this scale. The question that arises today is not whether it is possible to repeat this feat. It's because we stopped believing it was. In times of energy crises, pandemics, and industrial paralysis, Kaiser's logic remains one of the simplest and most brutal responses. Organization beats improvisation, system beats instinct, production beats rhetoric, and the impossible, almost always, is just an untested belief. Today the world bows to algorithms but hesitates before steel. It discusses technology but forgets logistics. It admires innovation but abandons manufacturing. And perhaps because of this, banal crises become global collapses. The Liberty story isn't just an epic war narrative. It's a manual for how to think on a large scale, of how to assemble, adjust, replicate, produce, distribute, deliver, not with punctual genius but with constant method. While contemporary experts debate deadlines of months to expand a production line, Kaiser has built 12 shipyards in 1 year. While modern projects sink into bureaucracy and doubt, he welded steel with hands newly trained by women and immigrants without degrees. And he delivered. More than 18 million tons of cargo crossed the oceans inside the Liberty. Tanks, radios, engines, rifles, wheat, boots, gasoline, entire hospitals in boxes. None of this would have arrived if someone had decided to wait for the ideal. Kaiser proved that the ideal is the enemy of the necessary, and that what is necessary, when well coordinated, is enough to conquer empires. If the 21st century needs an industrial lesson, it will not come from modern textbooks. It will come from the Richmond shipyards, from the sweaty steel, of the welds judged fragile, of the ships that were born to last a short time, and lasted longer than entire doctrines. And if you listening to all this still wonder if it is worth remembering, consider one last irony. The ship that became a joke on the drawing board is now a symbol in museums, and the generals who ridiculed him disappeared at the bottom of the books. But there remains an epilogue, a number, one final view, because sometimes to understand the greatness of a feat, you have to listen not to the heroes, but the defeated. And the last word will come from where you least expect it. The confidential report of a Nazi commando, which acknowledged, too late, the mistake of having underestimated the industry. When the smoke finally settled over the Atlantic and the warports silenced their cranes, what was left was not just the sound of victory, but the echo of a miscalculation. The German High Command had bet on a cold equation, that it could sink faster than the Allies could build, but they underestimated a variable that was not included in their intelligence reports. The industrial spirit of a civilian without a uniform. In less than 3 years, the United States launched 2,710 Liberty ships into the sea. Every 4 days, a new steel colossus rolled off the assembly line. And behind this unthinkable production were not generals, nor academics. There were welders, housewives, immigrants, and factory workers who had never touched a ship. While Type 7 submarines descended like silent predators, Kaiser's shipyards responded with pure mathematics. 3 ships launched, 2 sunk. The account no longer closed for Berlin, and the doctrine of scarcity, the foundation of Nazi strategy, collapsed in the face of organized excess. This was not just a naval victory, it was a revolution of mentality, because the war has shown that tanks, planes, and armored divisions are useless without supplies, without fuel, without spare parts. It showed that the rear is as lethal as the front line, and that logistics do not accompany the war. It decides the war. It was the ability to transport that allowed the offensive. It was the industrial rhythm that sustained the front. It was the liberty, and everything it carried, that pushed the Axis into the abyss. And more than that, it was proof that when there is purpose, coordination, and courage to break traditions, the impossible becomes statistics. Years later, before the tribunal of history, a German officer would sum up this defeat with a bitter and precise phrase: "We were not defeated by tanks. We were overcome by trucks, by boxes, by rhythm. We were defeated by the production." If you have come this far and believe that these stories deserve to be told seriously, leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell to support the research and the search for historical truth. Comment below. What was the most shocking data for you in this video? The production every 4 days? The forbidden welding that has become standard? Or the fact that the greatest arsenal of the war was built by hands that were never at the front? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.